You want?
I don't, I don't know what cloud it's going to, but all right. Welcome, everyone. Thank you for taking the time to learn a little bit about Dry January and the new resources that we've released through Reporting on Addiction. I am going to share a little bit of information about our project and Reporting on Addiction broadly, and then the specific resources, and then we will jump into our discussion. What we're talking about today is Dry January, and we've released a series of resources about a week and a half ago related to how to improve our coverage of Dry January. If you're a journalist, you know that this is a thing that gets a lot of coverage over the month of January, but it's also something that gets touched on during Sober October, Dry July, and really throughout the year when we're talking about alcohol use. So our goal as Reporting on Addiction is to help journalists throughout that entire year of reporting and not just leave it at January. So one of the foundational components of reporting on addiction and a good baseline whenever we do these discussions is just remembering that journalists don't want to harm their communities. Journalists don't wake up every morning thinking like, how can I write this problematic story? How can I write this incomplete story? How can I write this inaccurate story? They're really trying to do their jobs well, and their jobs aren't easy. And so we work with journalists very closely, and we try to remind folks and help folks understand that their job's really hard, and it's our job as experts to help bridge that gap to help improve their reporting. So if we ever see problems with reporting, like we've seen with Dry January, our goal is to help build that connection between experts and journalists to improve coverage. We know that it's really important to do this because the reporting has a big impact on communities and overall policy. So we'll talk a little bit about why, when we think about our alcohol coverage in particular, a lot of it's focused on individual behaviors as opposed to community-based and policy-based solutions that could really improve overall health and well-being. And so that's one of those things that we would like to see improved going forward. So it's on us, of course, as journalists and editors to improve our news coverage, and it's on Reporting on Addiction to bridge those gaps between folks. Our goal as Reporting on Addiction is to create a more accurate and empathetic public discourse about addiction and substance use, and we do that a few different ways. So we improve language used by journalists based on the AP Style book and additional research about stigma and discrimination. And that talks about how things are framed in stories, the words that are used, the narratives, the themes, and how that can really shape our public perception and understanding and create barriers at a policy level. Then we also provide support around images and video creation. We created a first of its kind resource to help journalists create images or use images that we have available that don't do further harm in their community. So for example, when we're thinking about alcohol use and Dry January, a lot of the images are just bottles of booze or people drinking. For people that are in long-term recovery or are struggling with alcohol use disorder, it might be a challenge on them to see a bunch of pictures in the news all the time of like bottles of beer or martinis. And so it's just something that we can think about and become a little bit more creative and, again, hopefully do less harm and increase the accuracy and empathy of our coverage. Our impact so far, and I'll do this super quick, but the constituents of this webinar today hit across all of these groups. And whenever we develop resources, we make sure we develop them across all of the groups. So we work with professional journalists. So if you're a professional journalist that's covering this topic, you can always reach out. We do what's called pitch to publication technical assistance. So when you're thinking about the story, you're getting pitched the story, the editor sends you a story, you can reach out. We can help you find sources, help you think through some of the pitfalls of the coverage in the past so you can improve it. And then we help after the publication process and beyond, really. We're here to help throughout that. Of course, educators. Alicia is a student educator at USC and a professional journalist. And so she knows that and is excited about that next generation of journalists. And so we try to help both professional journalists and that next generation to close that gap and lead to this change as quickly as possible. Because working with one or the other group is just, it's just going to take a lot longer. So we're happy to do that. We're in 19 journalism schools right now. And if you're an educator that's interested in this topic or others, we're in the process of starting to recruit for our summer 2024 or 2025, oh my gosh, cohort. And then we work with experts. So Michael and Molly on the call are experts through experience and through training. And so what we try to do is bridge that gap between those experts, and we provide media training and a platform so that they can share their perspectives to journalists like what we're doing today. So how we help journalists specifically, we do trainings, we provide toolkits, and we do that pitch to publication support. So at any point in the process, if you are covering things around drug use or addiction and you need help, that's what we do. We really do like everything. So we have specific topical area toolkits like this Dry January resource that we did. This webinar is part of our training, but we do additional newsroom-wide training, and we'll talk about that in a second. And then that pitch to publication support that I talked about. So why do we care, especially for dry January? Why do we care about the whole newsroom covering it? Is because we know that when it comes to drug use and addiction, it is not just a health or science reporter. Dry January is like the perfect example of this because it gets a ton of coverage, but it's like every part of the newsroom is touching on this. There were business articles about how this has an impact on non-alcoholic beverages or the bar and service industry. Arts and entertainment with celebrities that were engaging in dry January or are in long-term recovery. Politics or sports and how it impacts tax or legislation or professional athletes and or college athletes and their sobriety journeys. And so again, it's just one of those things that it's going to hit on all of those different parts of the newsroom. We recognize that different parts of the newsroom have those different angles, but at the end of the day, our mission is to help whatever part of the newsroom that you're in have that science and health lens, because it doesn't do any good if you're talking about it from an arts and entertainment perspective and you're talking about a celebrity's dry January journey. You don't help your audience understand, like, how do you actually cut back from drinking in a healthy way? What are some resources that are available for you? Because as cool as it is to read about a celebrity, if I leave that not knowing what to do and no solutions to address my own alcohol use, then we haven't really done our full job. So I'm going to cover these tips like super quick because they're going to be part of the webinar discussion, but I figured it'd be worth throwing a slide in. We're going to talk about, of course, how important it is to talk to experts as a journalist, talk about the risks associated with alcohol use and suddenly stopping alcohol use, acknowledge that changing drinking behavior can be difficult for folks, and that including evidence-based tips to help reduce drinking is an important part of our role as journalists and an ethical responsibility. We'll talk a little bit about Damp January, which is a newer construct. Talk about how important it is to check your bias as a journalist because alcohol use is so common and prevalent. And then, of course, we'll talk about our story tag here. And the story tag is one of those things that even if you don't do any of those other 6 things, which we definitely think you should do, and there's an ethical imperative to do those things, the easiest thing that you can do is just include a story tag. And so that's just talking about, and addressing the reader that, sometimes it's hard to cut back and you might need some more support and you're not alone. And so that really addresses those. One, it normalizes that it can be challenging for folks and it helps them realize that this is not a thing that they need to do in isolation, and that provides them with direct access to resources. When you're reading this, you'll notice that it's not a thing that is usually included in alcohol coverage, especially dry January coverage. And that's one of the things that we would really like to see improved, because at the end of the day, people, when they're engaging with your dry January resources, are interested in cutting back. And so what can we do to help them do that in a way that's healthy and safe and actually leads to these great long-term outcomes? So I do want to again thank everyone, obviously, on the call here, but Dr. Poling couldn't join us. She's from Michigan State. She helped review the documents as well, and same with Dr. Mishka Turplin. And so Alicia is here. I will introduce, actually, might as well do the introductions now. Alicia is one of our panelists here today. She is the founder and publisher of the Riverside Record in California. She's also an adjunct professor at the University of California, or University of Southern California, and one of our journalism educators as part of our cohort. Molly McGrath is an independent consultant and addiction advocacy public consultant. And then Michael Caldwell is, I have it blocked here because I don't have it memorized, is the chief medical officer at Dry January, USA, and the professor of public health at the Meharry Medical School of Global Health. So we're really excited to have these folks be here on the call today and add their perspective to our Dry January resources. And I'm going to end the slideshow because that's enough of me. Did I do that? Yes. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about the Dry January resources and some different things that we can do to help improve coverage. So Molly, I wanted to start, or actually, Michael, I want to start with you because you are the home of Dry January USA. So I thought it'd be nice to have some perspective and just grounding in, I've just talked a bunch about Dry January, but I didn't define Dry January. So do you mind just defining for the audience what Dry January it is and why it's an important concept?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks so much. It's really great to meet all of you and also to have the resources. So real kudos to Reporting on Addiction and your whole team there for helping to help journalists, help our communities. So Dry January is a phenomenon that has had a grassroots in England, and it has now spread globally. It became an organized structure about 10 years ago when a charity called Alcohol Change UK actually got the trademark for Dry January. And then they started to sub-license it to other countries throughout the globe. about 3.5 years ago, Meharry Medical College, which is a historically Black medical school in Nashville, Tennessee, almost 150 years old, decided that we would be the sole licensee of the Dry January USA brand. So we are now the very first and only home for the organized Dry January USA organization. So what does that mean? That means we are connected to that global effort of Dry January. When you are looking for somebody that has the organizational and credibility to talk about the history of Dry January. We have an app, a free app called Try Dry, and we like to connect science with communities. And each one of us who are representing the leadership in different countries are trying our best to take the Dry January tools and make it so that they're a good match for our particular country. So we are really excited. We just launched the dryjanuaryusa.org website. We've got a lot of tools there. And we provide context for people to understand that you don't have to do Dry January on your own. If you use our app, the Try Dry app, you have a double of a chance of being successful. So thanks so much for inviting me today, and we look forward to the discussion.
Sure. Thanks, Michael. I really appreciate that context. I see you're wearing the yellow too. Do you mind talking a little bit about the yellow?
Well, yes, thank you. Yeah, well, what we did this year is transformationally come up with something new to grab people's attention. And I did research for the last 50 years. I looked for a signal of how people connected with each other who are not drinking or doing other drugs. So I went back for 50 years at Grateful Dead concerts and then Phish concerts, and now even the Green Bay Packers. The color yellow is connected with people as a signal for not drinking. The yellow is very prominent in our Try Dry app as well. And I bet you if you look at other alcohol related or Dry January stories or sober stories, you'll probably see the color yellow pop up. So what we did was tie it all together and made yellow the official color of Dry January. And we expect this to be as big as pink in October. We started this year and we denoted January 7th as the official Dry January Day, where after the holidays have settled down, we all can come together and ask our communities to issue proclamations, to light up buildings yellow, and to come together in the spirit of Dry January. And this is a good time to say that Dry January is really for everyone. There's some people who don't drink, or they say, oh, I don't need Dry January. Well, I'd like to say we all need Dry January, because Dry January is a state of mind. And whether you drink or not drink, alcohol affects you and your community. So it's important that everyone understand it and learn how it can improve not only your health if you are drinking, but your community's health. So whether you're a medical provider, whether you're a journalist, if you just use your community, drive down the road, Dry January is important to you.
Thank you, Michael, for sharing that. And we will definitely loop back in on the cultural aspects of Dry January and what we can see at a community level to lead to some of these sustainable changes. Alicia, I'm interested in your perspective, of course, as a journalist, and specifically what you've noticed with coverage around Dry January, or when you think about like students that are interested in it, or those professional journalists when you see the stories. What is it? Some things that you're picking up on?
So what we say a lot when we see journalists cover Dry January, it's the buzz, it's the trend. It's a trending thing that we all do after the gluttonous holiday season, um, that really cements drinking as the standard, as the normal, as what everybody does. And now we all need to cut back and be a little healthier. Um, it also focuses a lot on things to replace that. So, like mocktails or non alcoholic drinks or non alcoholic beverages, kind of selling you a product that you don't really need in most cases. um, if you're not drinking alcohol, have a glass of water, like all of these things. And so it really focuses on the trend and also selling people a product that we really should be focusing more on the health aspects. I've seen a lot of shift over the past 3, 4 years as we have had more celebrities come out and say, "Hey, I've stopped drinking because XYZ." And so it's become more normalized, but it's not anywhere near where the coverage should be in order to actually effectuate change and to also stop the stigma of um, substance abuse or being sober.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Alicia. Yeah, we're definitely going to loop back around to that stigma component because I think that's a really big part. And you're right, 100% that there's a lot of the coverage that just end up normalizing alcohol use at like the other 11 months of the year are the alcohol use times, and then January is just about some sort of evaluation, and that's part of the goal with these resources to help journalists think about how do you cover it beyond that initial period to help lead to some of these sustained health behaviors, which I know Michael as a public health expert and Molly as public health experts, those are the types of things you're really passionate about. Molly, so for Dry January, like I said, it's really covered or like captured the attention. It's just a huge, huge thing, to the point where it's spun off into Damp January and all of these other things. And I'm wondering your perspective as, a professional in this space. Again, like what do you see as missing from that different lens as a non-journalist? And what do you think are some things that you would like to see, when we're talking to journalists, improve in the coverage?
Well, I just wanted to thank you to Reporting on Addiction for involving me in this project. I I have lived experience in my family with alcohol use disorder, so I'm very familiar with it. And I recently left a position at the American Society of Addiction Medicine, where I worked very closely with Dr. Poland, who was the chair of our committee there. So I just wanted to give that background on myself. But I mean, in terms of Dry January, I think a few things, well, three things I would say that are missing. I think that, journalists should try to gently acknowledge that alcohol itself is a very easily accessible, available, legal, cheap substance of misuse, and that it can be dangerous. And it's so normal in our society to drink. I think that for journalists, they're put in a difficult spot, of sort of having to write something that people don't really want to necessarily hear. The second thing is, I think, Dry January is a thoughtful way to encourage people to evaluate why they drink, but going a step further and making the point that it's actually commonplace for people in this country to lose their ability to control their drinking and develop an alcohol use disorder. I think that can help reduce the stigma and shame associated with AUD. One statistic that I just read is 1/3 of the US population meets criteria for AUD over their lifetime. That's a huge chunk of the US population. And recovery from it is common, too. So there's, there's that upside to it. I just think acknowledging that, that it is a big problem in our nation could help, prevent or mitigate harm, to people that that experience a lot of hardship. And then the third thing I think that sometimes is missing from the conversation and is probably maybe the most difficult thing to address is the role of industry. I think that you can compare the alcohol and tobacco lobbies. They're huge and powerful. They, have a lot of influence in government. And so I think, just acknowledging the role, that industry plays and perhaps preventing policies from being enacted that would better protect public safety and improve public health. Again, a difficult thing for journalists to write, but I think that's missing too.
No, it's such an important perspective, Molly, and you're pulling on a thread that Alicia shared too, with that role of kind of industry pushing some of these narratives, especially during dry or damp January. Michael, I'm wondering if you have some perspective on that from your public health lens, and that analogy that Molly had between the tobacco and alcohol industry, I think is a really salient one, but I think journalists don't really see those two groups as very similar because like tobacco is so obviously bad because smoking is cancer. And so maybe you could talk a little bit about some of that shift that we're seeing in our awareness of those things, and how, as journalists, we can help improve some of that public awareness of those changes from a public health perspective.
Yeah, I'm really glad you brought that up. I think probably one of the reasons you just noted that reflection was because journalists tend to be younger. I don't think they remember what it was 35, 40 years ago. I'm lucky. I do. I very much remember my favorite health reporter at the Poughkeepsie Journal. I served as the Commissioner of Health for Dutchess County, New York, from 1994 to 2014. And yeah, if you look back, the newsrooms were known to be smoking dens, as were nurses' offices, hospitals, doctors' offices. I graduated medical school in 1990, residency in 1993. In Mount Sinai Medical Center, the hospitals were still allowing smoking. I think that just is something people cannot imagine who did not live back then. And there's no question, I've dedicated a lot of my career to tobacco control. I see bright lines of connectivity. There's no question about it. So one of the values, I think, in those lessons, and me having lived through it and seeing it, is know that we have to begin, and we're already on course for a public education campaign. We cannot just turn off the switches. It has to happen layer by layer by layer. And where does that start? It'll start in the newsrooms. It'll start in our doctors' offices, our hospitals. People who are already not understanding or getting that alcohol is as bad as tobacco, we need them to internalize it, to champion it in their own communities, areas. So, for example, I've gone in the last few years to the annual meeting of the Research Society for Alcohol, right? Alcohol, RSA. It's primarily a group of young people who are doing alcohol research. And let me tell you, they do not talk about non-alcoholic beverages. They talk about alcohol in their scientific meetings all day, and then they cannot wait to go out to the happy hour and get their drink tickets where they can have 2, 3, or 4 drinks. So there's a real disconnect right now among those who are doing the science on alcohol, those who are treating people on alcohol, those who are reporting on alcohol. I say if we can, as a community that cares about moving the needle on this, let's focus on them first, because we need them to then lead to the greater community. We could do it kind of in a shotgun approach, but I've seen that once we got the smoking out of the hospitals, right, it became more normalized. Once we got it out of the newsrooms, if we could. So these are just some reflections that I have.
No, Michael, that's wonderful, and your perspective on those younger folks. I just wondered, Alicia, if you wanted to share, as someone who works with young journalists all day, every day. And then I don't want to put you on the spot, but that idea of alcohol use in newsrooms, or alcohol as part of, I don't want to say reporting, but part of that social aspect of meeting a source for a drink or the conferences. That's also something that you see in journalism spaces, I'm sure.
Yeah. As soon as he was talking about reporters and drinking, I was like, oh, like the editor who had a bottle of scotch in his office every day. Um, like these are just like, they are tropes, but they are also based in fact. I remember when the Chicago Tribune, when I worked there, won a Pulitzer for its reporting. And what did we do? We had a champagne toast in the newsroom where everybody was invited. Um, and you see that a lot of the older journalists are the ones who really perpetuate the alcohol in the newsroom stereotype. Um, and a lot of younger journalists just don't drink as much. Um, I don't know if that's because we're not being paid well, so we don't have that excess income to spend on alcohol, or if we're just not drinking as much because it's not really a social thing that we do in general anymore. So I would say that among younger journalists, drinking is definitely on a decline across newsrooms that I've been in. Um, Usually when my students hear talking about things, they're like, hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee at Starbucks. Let's go to Trader Joe's and see what they have new in store. Like it's not very rarely is it, hey, let's go get a drink after class. So I think tides are changing and times are changing. Um, but yeah, it's definitely going to be a hard one to get the alcohol and that kind of stereotype out of the newsroom.
Yeah,
I
for
think
sure.
that's a great point, but as I'm thinking, the growth, explosive growth of these adult non-alcoholic beverages
Yeah.
is in your face every day and growing. It's nowhere near where it needs to be to trigger it. But I think that the more people will go out somewhere or just say, hey, let me try that non-alcohol beer. I hear that's really good. Now that's brand new news. That didn't exist 5, 6 years ago.
Yeah.
You, I served as the commissioner of health of Nashville during COVID, I can tell you, and alcohol was also on my, that's how I got into this too, because I saw the rise in alcohol. And I would tell my colleagues at the Nashville Public Health Department, oh yeah, I drink non-alcohol beer. They would make fun of me, like, why would you do that? It tastes terrible. It's like a punishment. Just have water. Don't have that non-alcohol beer. Now that was only 5 years ago. Now that's completely changed. So you have the growth in the adult non-alc beverage industry constantly. People, of course, the rise of weed and THC drinks and all that, and that whole, and then you have the growing scientific evidence, right? And people wanting to be healthy. Ultimately, I think that when people choose to reflect on alcohol, we're not anti-alcohol. We just want to give people a mirror and the tools, the TryDry app, to think about their relationship with alcohol. And it is not static, it is dynamic over their lives. People, for different reasons, they'll just have a little, they never thought they could have 4 drinks a day. And suddenly they've looked back and oh my God, they've had 4 drinks a day for the last 3 months. So it's so important that people understand that alcohol is a gateway to doing other positive things in their life. So that's why it's great around New Year's, like, oh, what's your New Year's resolution? Well, whatever you want to achieve, if you continue alcohol at the same level, if you do drink, it's going to not allow you to achieve all these other things. So we think of that also as opening up the yellow, the brightness of your life, who you are, and being able to do great things.
Thank you, Michael and Alicia. Molly, I saw you start to sit up. Did you have something that you wanted to add, especially about the NA part of it?
About the what?
Non-alcoholic drink part of it, and how sometimes for folks in recovery that can be a
Yeah, I
challenge
mean, I
too.
think
Yeah.
that in general, that's a good thing. And I think, what Alicia was saying earlier too, that generally younger people are drinking less. Like, I think that came out in the Monitoring the Future study. But also, I don't think that, mocktails or they're not necessarily a solution for people who, have whatever level of an alcohol use disorder, because you're still engaging in the behavior. And it's the behavior that's the problem. So I don't know if that was.
Yeah, no, thank you, Molly. And yeah, it's just important, and that's why this resource and these conversations are so great across different audiences and different perspectives, because it's one of the trickiest things. Because Michael, you're right. Like the broader awareness and availability of NA products can be really positive, but then there's going to be some folks that they do not like them, or they're just not part of their recovery journey. And nobody's saying that like NA should be everywhere, or it should be like in your face, and like that's the only way going forward. But creating these cultural conversations and these spaces for people to navigate their drinking and reflect on their drinking is the goal of Dry January. And that's part of what we're hoping that journalism can convey, as opposed to just a list of NA mocktails. Like that's not really going to push people to reevaluate their relationship with alcohol or lead to some of these healthier changes. Michael, I did, and this is for Molly too. One of the pieces of advice that we give that might sound contradictory to a journalist is, talking about those risks associated with drinking, while also talking about the risks associated with stopping drinking. And so I don't think that those are contradictory, but you can see why a journalist, when they hear that, they might say, well, so I'm supposed to tell people to not drink, but also when they stop drinking, they might have all of these problems. So do you mind talking a little bit about why it's important to, when we talk about cutting back from drinking or stopping, why it's important to talk about it in that nuanced way?
Yeah. Is that for me first, or?
Oh, sure. Yeah.
Well, I think both of these conversations we've just had are converge here about the non-alc beverages and drinking too much, because ultimately it has to be tailored to the individual person. I think as a broad public health benefit, having these non-alc beverages is sort of a ramp off for people to get them to think. But there's no question that there's people who need to be fully abstinent. Now, remember also, it's only in the last 5 years or so that our National Institute of Alcohol Abuse and Alcoholism has even addressed the issue of harm reduction, right? What is harm reduction? That basically is saying to people, different than what they've said in Alcoholics Anonymous, which is that, no, you are an alcoholic. You will always be, you must reject it. You must be abstinent for your life. Now, there's absolute value in that. It works. It helps a lot of people. And a lot of people, that's the only way they can live. But that message doesn't really resonate with the majority of people who may have alcohol use disorder, that may be able to recover in different ways, offers, different pathways for that. So I think similarly, when we always say to people, hey, try January, try Dry January. Oh, Dry January day is January 7th. If you can't quit for good, I don't say quit for a day. I say reflect on your use of alcohol that day. There was something called the Great American Smokeout, which is in November every year. We say quit for the day, you can quit for good. So I always say on that day, reflect on your use of alcohol. Because you're right. I've categorized this to be clear and simple. So if you are drinking 5 or more drinks a day, man or woman, you should probably work to do Dry January with a medical provider. That's the easiest way I could say it without having to say drink, don't drink, and all of this. So I say Dry January is a journey. It is a state of mind. It is a reflection on your use of alcohol. If you choose to eliminate it completely, no, there may be danger if you drink every day, but it's a pathway off.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And before I shift to Molly with it, do you mind talking a little bit about why a health professional would be helpful in those situations for somebody that's engaging in that more frequent or heavier drinking behavior?
Yes. Well, those of us who have worked in emergency rooms know very well when there is somebody who comes in who's drinking not just 5 drinks a day, but 5 bottles a day. And they come in for some other medical problem, and they have to be weaned off of that alcohol, because it could be damage. It could be fatal if they do not get treated appropriately. Plus, there are other medicines and tools, and you're on the Reporting on Addiction website really offers this to tell people that you don't have to struggle alone. Medical providers have so many tools. The Try Dry app is one, but the medicines that can help people take some of the edge off, especially for the first weeks and months that people are trying to reduce if they have a lot of alcohol in their lives. So I hope that answers your question.
Yeah, no, thank you, Michael. Molly, did you want to add a little something about why it might be helpful for a journalist to talk about or to include, if you're going to cut back, it could be helpful to talk to a medical provider as opposed to just trying to go solo. I know some people go solo, but where is the role of a medical provider potentially in this space or in this conversation?
Yeah. Oh, that's a tough question. I think that finding treatment for alcohol use disorder can be really complicated, but it's important. I think a lot of primary care physicians do know about medications for AUD, and you know, acknowledging that, you know, it's human to like to drink, right? And one of the reasons that people like drinking is, your body releases endogenous opioids, like your body makes endogenous opioids. And that's one of the reasons that naltrexone works, which is one of the FDA approved medications for AUD and probably like the most effective one. So I think, you know, healthcare professionals can easily increase, you know, access to medications for alcohol use that, you know, would really help. You know, and I also think that alcohol use in its advanced stages, you know, will literally destroy someone's internal organs, you know, and so like it is that lethal when it gets to a certain point, and you know, that you know, needs to be acknowledged too. And I guess like the last thing I would say is, you know, a lot of people, in terms of like treatment for alcohol use, like being still kind of in the dark ages, like I think it's important to acknowledge that like a lot of people naturally recover. You know, I think it's like 70% of people recover without interventions. But for certain people, like Dr. Caldwell said, you know, professional help is absolutely necessary.
Yeah, no, that makes a ton of sense. And Alicia, I'm going to tie all this together. So we're talking about those risks associated with cutting back or stopping. And I think as a journalist, because of the culture of alcohol in newsrooms, I know you mentioned that it's a little different for younger journalists, but like the overall just and drinking and culture generally, you know, you don't see in the Dry January coverage a lot of conversations with public health experts like Molly and Michael, with those folks. So why would it be important, and why, when you talk to your student journalists with alcohol in particular, do you say like, I know you maybe have drank before, as opposed to like heroin? I mean, there might be some kids in your class that have used heroin, but like it's a lot less frequent, right? Where alcohol, they may have drank alcohol, their parents may, it's at social situations, it's at party, frat party, football games, whatever. It's just so much more prevalent. And so there's that perception that like, I get it. Like as a student, as a journalist, whatever, like I see it. Okay, you just stop and do whatever. Where do you think the value comes from talking to those experts, and why do you think as a journalist it's actually necessary when talking about alcohol to talk with public health experts like the folks that we have on this call?
Yeah, absolutely. Always talking to experts. It's one of the things that I tell my students they have to do for every story. Find an expert who can talk to this. And that can be expert through experience, that can be expert through training. However, we need to have an expert voice who can give additional context to the story that we're framing. I think in this particular case, it's really important because a lot of folks don't understand that like close to 500 people die each day from excessive alcohol use. And that's according to the CDC. That's like 20 people, 20 people every hour. And to not have that context in a story about alcohol, I think is just not providing that context to folks. And so when we talk to public health professionals, we are able to add the context of no, alcohol is not healthy for you. As great as it makes you feel, it's not good for your body. These are all the ways that it is not good for you. And also, if you are experiencing an alcohol use disorder, you may not be able just to stop drinking. Whether that's by choice or by doctor, like you might not be able to just stop and be fine. And I think that when we add that additional context, it allows us to look at alcohol as more of a public health issue than an individual thing, which is something that we should be looking at, the systemic use of alcohol and the systemic stigma of alcohol use disorder. as opposed to just an individual's actions, especially when it comes to things like Dry January or Sober October.
Yeah, Michael and Molly, I'm sure you're teed up to talk about those public health responses that are just lacking from coverage right now. And I think the focus, it makes sense in Dry January to focus on those individual actions, but we know that there are some different types of public health interventions that would also be effective that don't really get any coverage at all. And some are really, interesting conversations or debates that are happening right now, like labeling, kind of similar to cigarettes, or that risk association with cancer. So if both of you don't mind talking a little bit about that and why it's important to maybe provide some of that context. I'm not saying every Dry January story should mention cancer, but like maybe.
Maybe. Do you want to go first, Dr. Cottle?
Oh, please, Molly, go ahead.
Okay. Yeah, I think that maybe the most important policy intervention that is not discussed is the alcohol excise tax, which hasn't been changed since 1991. I think that, anything really, I mean, there are pros and cons to that policy intervention, like it, in terms of like the economics of it. But the fact that alcohol is so inexpensive and legal, I think that would be one of the most effective policy interventions that we could benefit from in this country. With the labeling, I saw that, and I just recall from my research during my my graduate student program that and I think that most labeling on cigarettes is not considered that effective. You can I don't think we have it in this country, but in other countries you'll see really gross pictures on cigarette, and but I do think that we need to gently move in that direction, with alcohol. So.
Yeah, I'm glad you brought that up. I think the Surgeon General's advisory is as historic as the one from the Surgeon General from 1964 linking cancer to tobacco. So now what we have is 55% of Americans who did not realize or understand or comprehend that cancer can be linked to alcohol use, even at moderate levels. And what is shocking, I think, to me also, and I hope to more Americans, and this story needs to be told over and over again, is the number one cancer that is most greatly impacted, even at lower levels, is breast cancer. And there's nothing that drives me crazier than to see in October pink alcoholic cocktails being sold to raise money for research into breast cancer without at least a mention to say, by the way, we appreciate you buying this alcoholic, but this may increase your risk of cancer as you drink it. So that, to me, I'm not against alcohol. It's just trying to give people information. Knowledge is power, even though the cancer warnings on the tobacco may have lost its impact over time. If you go back initially, the eye opening was so dramatic, and we need to take what has been given a gift to us by the Surgeon General Advisory as a call to action. Why? Ultimately, the process of having the public dialogue of saying we should have labels on, whether we should have cancer warnings on alcohol labels, whether they happen or not, it almost doesn't matter. It raises the drumbeat in the public discourse. If you look back, I don't know if you actually have a way to map out the number of stories that have been done on Dry January this year compared to previous years, but I would bet that there was an injection of interest because of the Surgeon General's advisory. No question about it. So that is not going to disappear. That is now part of the public conversation. So we have that to talk about, because there are a dozen reasons why you shouldn't want to have alcohol in your life or reduce alcohol in your life. And for 55% of people now, they're like, oh, wow, that might trigger me to really think, I don't want to give cancer a head start. I'm getting older. I'm trying to do things to reduce my risk of cancer. I didn't know. You don't know how many people, knowledgeable people, have come up to me and have said, Michael, I just didn't know. And I know, but see, this is shocking. It's shocking to people in medicine, or so it's like, well, we've known for years. But that's why I was so excited when the Surgeon General brought this announcement out, because even for me personally, I was thinking, do I have something wrong here? Every time I talk about alcohol, I say, oh, by the way, it increases your risk of cancer. And people are like, oh yeah, everything causes cancer. No, actually, only two things cause cancer that you can control. Two things that you can focus on to reduce your risk of cancer. One is processed red meats and alcohol. That's, well, tobacco too. We know that. All right. So, but things that people don't realize: processed red meats and alcohol. So I feel that this is now a call to action, and it will bring us together throughout the year. And I'd just like to summarize to say that Dry January really is a state of mind. So whatever else you call it, it is Dry January. It's that Dry January state of mind. So if you call it by another name or another month, ultimately it's the Dry January movement. And we have 60 million Americans doing it together. Now, I used to try to get people to do the Great American Smokeout every year for a day. We didn't have that number of people coming together at the same time. So that is a dramatic societal shift. And what about people that are in businesses, right? High corporate businesses that celebrate with drinks. Now they have an excuse. They need help. Oh, I'm doing Dry January, sorry. Now people will still make fun of them for doing it, but it's dissipating. The people who are making fun of them are saying, oh yeah, I think I may try that this year. So there's always hope for tomorrow.
No, thank you, Michael. And yeah, I definitely take your point about the labeling. And I think Molly, you're right that the tobacco labeling, especially now, like everybody knows there's tobacco and cigarettes. But so few people know that the risk between alcohol and cancer. And so, like Michael said, I think, yeah, that conversation happening and being part of Dry January coverage, or your alcohol coverage in general, can really increase that awareness. And that in itself is a really great public health and solutions focused thing. The last thing, and Michael, you kind of touched on this just with your last comment about executives, and I think Alicia, you said too, your newsroom when cheering with champagne, and I'm just wondering if, and this can be for anyone, when we think about the broader cultural and social aspects of drinking and cutting back from drinking or Dry January, part of that is just trying to be more inclusive. So that can be with NA products. That can also just be with being kind to people that aren't drinking. That's usually a pretty great place to start. So I'm wondering if you have seen some just general improvements in that, and if there's a way that maybe how we talk about it in the news can help normalize not drinking. I know you talked about that a little bit, Alicia. A lot of the coverage right now makes it seem like the default is drinking. So what ways can we kind of shift that as a journalist to help the default be not drinking, or that not drinking is in itself normal?
Oh, that's so tough. Because as journalists, we always try to help people to become more informed so that they can make better choices for themselves, for their families, for their communities. All of us come into this field wanting people to have the best information possible and fighting tooth and nail to get that information in front of them. So I think a lot of work can still be done around large scale media and our representations of news and journalism and the wider industry. So like film and television and all of this stuff. We know that, what people are seeing on TikTok is more likely to influence them than a recommendation made from like Wirecutter. And so I think this needs to be a larger conversation about how we, in all of the media ecosphere, um, really talk about alcohol and talk about our consumption of alcohol and normalize that. I will say though, in the newsroom, when I was at the Chicago Tribune for 4 years, and at the start of it, we had a colleague who did not drink, and whenever we would go out after work, have drinks, go to, the Billy Goat, whatever, there was always at least one or two people there who would be like, hey, why aren't you drinking? And by the end of my 4 years there, not a single person would ask him. And I think that's a progress. I think that is showing growth in our newsroom spaces, showing growth in how we talk about things. Because that's not a question you need to ask somebody. I'm not drinking. Okay, cool. What do you want to drink then? Like, do you want a soda? Do you want water? And so I think that shows that there is that growth that is happening, and we are coming to understand that more. And I think a lot of the ways in which we cover alcohol just needs to focus on that, like, hey, if somebody's not drinking, that's their own personal business. They don't need to announce it. Let them do what they want to do. And also work really, really hard to be like, if you drink or don't drink, that's not a moral thing. There's not a moral assigned to drinking or not drinking. And that's not a value judgment that we as journalists or we as people should be making.
Yeah, thank you, Alicia. Other thoughts on the improvements in, or other ways that we can try to improve those spaces? Molly, I know you have some perspectives.
Oh, I was just going to say, I mean, I have great faith in, well, maybe not great, but I have faith in like our future generations, like in some way that, not drinking will be made cool. Like, I think that, AA, like, it helps a ton of people. It's like very, very important, but it's still, it widely varies. And I think it can be difficult sometimes for young people to, go. So yeah, I was just going to add that it's possible that, it be made for not drinking to be made cool at some point.
Yeah, that's partially what's so exciting about the fact that Dry January has like really caught on. I think, Michael, you had a stat in your head about how many people are even aware of Dry January, and just from a public health intervention perspective, like it's connected, and the journalists are doing that. They're pushing that message, and that's part of why it's important to cover it with some of the advice that we have. But yeah, I don't know if Michael, you want to talk a little bit about how it's really caught on like wildfire, and how we can harness that to, like Molly said, kind of create a new, or help that new generation embrace these healthier behaviors. And the other older generations too. We don't want to forget about them, but.
Yeah, so it's basically some stats that I'm distilling down from a lot of different sources here. About a third of Americans don't drink, never drank. About a third of Americans kind of drink every day, more or less. And another third are somewhere in the middle. That's where you see those stats. Between 60, 70% of people have had a drink in the last 30 days or whatever. That's the continuum. About 50% of people have heard of Dry January. Now, for people who drink and know Dry January, they're shocked that anyone has never heard of Dry January. But I could tell you that of those people, they're from all walks of life, but the majority of those people don't drink, right? So the people who are around their surroundings, like alcohol is just not a part of their lives because of their families, their culture, their religion. They really haven't heard of Dry January. So what's good for journalists also to know is you're still introducing Dry January to people. Don't just assume that everyone knows about Dry January. And also don't assume that people who say, oh, I don't drink, I don't need to know about Dry January. Say to them, oh, it's important for you because it impacts the health of your community that you live in. It's really so important. And yeah, so we do believe now, from what we've seen, that year after year, the number of people that know about it is increasing. And the number of people participating is increasing. Why? Because there are so many people who now know someone that's brought it to their attention. I first learned about it in 2017. I was working at GlaxoSmithKline. A lot of my colleagues were from Europe. And it kind of, got some traction there. And it really is spread. With the growth of the non-alcoholic beverage industry, it's just giving more points of contact for people to talk about it. So I don't have to talk about Dry January. I could say, hey, do you know there's this new non-alcoholic bottle shop that's really got some great stuff in East Nashville, right? It's just another way for people to get into that conversation. Now, with the whole notion of cancer and employers, I think is just about to break open. I've been involved with the CEO Roundtable on Cancer for 25 years. It was started by former President George H.W. Bush and First Lady Barbara Bush. And they have something called the CEO Cancer Gold Standard. If you've never heard of it, please look it up because it's really valuable. And what this means is that you as an employer, an organization can sign up to get sort of a stamp of approval. You're doing everything you can to fight cancer. And you have like 5 domains. You got to fill out this application. And there's prevention. Make sure that all of your employees get screened for cancer, that you get them to clinical trials. They got survivorship issues. And big on that is tobacco-free campuses, helping your employees to quit tobacco if they can. Now, I can tell you 6 months ago, I went because Meharry Medical College is a part of this, Meharry School of Global Health, our research, we're part of the CEO Roundtable on Cancer. And I said, you know, you are silent on alcohol. I think it's time for the CEO Roundtable on Cancer not to be silent on alcohol. And they say, that's really good. I think that's important. And I said, you know, I went to our meeting here and the dinner, you did not offer one adult non-alcoholic beverage. It's a mindset. It's a mindset. So I say the public education program. So for me, right, I'm thinking back 30 years ago as if there's smoking going on in that room. It's silent. People just, they don't think about it. But you bring it to their attention and you're like, oh, yeah. So not only should the CEO Roundtable on Cancer, right, lead on this, which they aren't right now, they're going to be. But we should come up with one of those domains for the, in order to, in the future to be a CEO Cancer Gold Standard, you should have a policy on any time, either during business hours or after business hours, you're going out and alcohol is being used. You must, number one, care for people that may be in recovery and know you may trigger them and be thoughtful and mindful for them because you need to take care of your employees. And number two, you should have an equal number or at least a close to equal number of adult non-alcoholic beverages because they're available now if you're offering alcohol to people. Similar, so if you're offering beer, wine, and spirits, you roll a bar into like they did at GlaxoSmithKline in Philadelphia where I would work, we would go, this is the last thing I'll say, we would have these breakouts where team building, they'd bring these bicycle parts and we'd build bicycles for kids to go to parts of the community that needed bicycles. And in the middle of it, they'd bring in bars and everybody would be drinking. So we'd all be drinking, trying to put these bicycles together for the kids. It was just crazy. Nobody thought about it. It's a matter of just pausing and saying, no, we shouldn't do this. There are CEOs who sent their employees cases of wine during the pandemic to be able to get through the pandemic. It's just checking those types of things to saying, yeah, I guess that wasn't a good idea.
Oh, thank you, Michael. And thank you to the full panel, both for your contributions to the document and our discussion today. It's been really robust. As you can tell as a listener or someone that engages with our resources, alcohol is a tricky concept to report on well because it is so socially available, socially acceptable, and widely available and cheap, as Molly said, compared to other countries. Because of some of those lack of policy issues like was brought up, the powerful, super powerful industry pushing against all of those policy things. So we recognize that it does make your reporting hard, but we're here to support that. We're going to be rolling out additional resources related to alcohol, specifically alcohol use disorder. We've talked a little bit about those treatments and medications and harm reduction and recovery. We're going to build out a lot more support for that. So if you are digging into this topic, we're here along that journey with you. And we know Dry January is just the start of it because it is the start of the year, but we'll be there for the whole thing. So thank you, Michael, Alicia, and Molly, for your contributions today and, of course, going forward. So thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
All right.